Hello, welcome to part 2 of the audio tape.
In this part of the tape, we will discuss a number of examples of how popular media can be used to teach language skills and other subjects. We asked Martha Mohoko how she used popular print media in her classroom.
With newspapers and magazines, what I normally do is that I try to encourage the children to look out for problems. Like, hey man, we've got a problem about violence in our community. Once it becomes a problem for all of us. And we try to research more about the problem and try and work out if there are any solutions. Those solutions that the children provide does not mean that it's solutions that will solve the problems of the country, but the solutions make the children aware. And if there's one thing I want to do in this country is to come up with children who are very, very, very aware.
We can use existing media as a resource for teaching, but we can also get learners to produce their own media as a learning experience. Is this as difficult as it sounds? Well, let's listen to two former English teachers, John Gultig and Mike Adendorf, give examples of how they have used this approach. But first, let's hear two young actors translating an excerpt from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet into a play set in Soweto.
Psst, Romeo! Itlokwane, Romeo! Oh, for a falconer's voice to lure this tasseled gentle back again. Bondage's horse, I may not speak aloud, otherwise I would tear this cave where echo lies and make her airy tongue more hoarse than mine, repeating my man's name, Romeo, Romeo.
Oh, ke chiriaka impitsa, utlwa voice ya hae. Oh, lerato mo bosiu. E tshwana le music o soft ditsebeng tse utlwellang.
Romeo!
Baby.
Romeo, ke tlo bona neng?
Tlo tava usane ka bo 9.
Ke tla be ke le da. Wait, tonight is going to feel like forever.
One of the most exciting things I ever did as a teacher was to actually use the format of the popular media. You know, most young people really enjoy movies, for instance. So to take the idea of a play and use that as a way to get people into quite inaccessible things like Shakespeare. So, I mean, children generally hate Shakespeare and they find it difficult. So what I tried to do was get them to play the role of producers or directors or writers of a play script or a film script and say, locate this in your own context. Do you recognize these kinds of characters? Do they live in your community? If they do live in your community, how do they speak now? How do they relate to other people?
I think the use of things like tape recorders and media to help one produce actually makes the whole thing more containable. One doesn't have to consider the expenses and difficulties of putting together a major stage production, which would probably take the whole year.
And I think for me it was what was very important was to try and balance their learning of key literary concepts and the enjoyment and the skills you learn by producing media. I suppose in many ways I separated the production phase, the actual talking into a tape recorder or the acting out, until a bit later. And at first I simply said, look, all you are scriptwriters now. So what I was trying to do was teach them how things like character and plot and so on work to actually make literature work.
You mentioned that you separated out the actual production for tape and got them to concentrate initially on the elements of plot and character and consistency and so on. And that's been my experience too. One needs to do that, but it's that end point of actually putting the production together as, say, a radio production or perhaps doing a small stage production of one part of the play, one scene, that generates such a lot of excitement that it carries kids through. And in fact, you cover a lot of ground in a very short time because of their excitement.
Some of the mistakes that people sometimes make is that they say, well, we'll discard the written Shakespeare and simply show them a film. And my problem with that is that the film is already an interpretation of Shakespeare. So I think it's very useful to show them a film, but show them after they've done their own interpretation. So what I did was I gave them a couple of examples, very short excerpts of different ways in which, for instance, Hamlet had been played, and showed them how the directors, the writers, can reinterpret Shakespeare, which was an inspiration to them. It gave them the right to go and do something with the characters. I think if you have a look at a lot of the modern film versions of Shakespeare, particularly youth versions of Shakespeare like the Romeo and Juliet, what they did there was mix a lot of original Shakespeare dialogue with sort of street gang lingo of LA. So, so I think that's a very nice idea, and it really gets people to, again, understand how metaphors work, and how the importance of language isn't just a matter of putting words on paper. It's about persuading people, it's about exciting people, it's about using rich language, and I think that's really very exciting. Many people might argue that this takes too long, but how would you respond to people who say you can't use a whole week on a couple of pages?
I think it's part of this misapprehension that so many teachers have, that everything has to be done to completion, that one has to cover a textbook from page 1 to page 300, that one has to cover a play from beginning to end. And in fact, that's not really how our minds work, and it's not really how learning works. One in fact darts about, and I think it's important to go into greater depth, and that immediately precludes trying to deal with any play or work of art or textbook, for that matter, in totality. One actually needs to select and find something that learners would be able to identify with. The key thing is to hook them on the play, the work of literature, to get their interest, to get their excitement.
And I think for the rest of the year, what I did was, like you said, I very often didn't read. I would skip 10 pages. But then what I also did was a variety of means. I used other media, like, for instance, tapes, and I would get different productions and say, okay, let's listen to this scene in this particular Shakespeare, and then let's just talk about that. And then I would summarize. I'd say, well, then for the next 10 pages, this happens. And then sometimes I also used a sort of soap opera technique by sort of ending a tape just before something really exciting was about to happen, and I wouldn't tell them what was going to happen. And what I found was that people would go home and read the next 2 or 3 pages. So there were a whole lot of techniques like that, but I think the importance is hook them on it, and things move much more quickly.